3001, The Final Odyssey, Arthur C. Clarke. 3001. Chapter 3, Rehabilitation. When he woke again and found a matron and nurses standing room his bed, Paul felt strong enough to assert himself. Where am I? Surely you can tell me that. The three women exchanged a glance, obviously uncertain what to do next. Then matron answered, enunciating her words very slowly and carefully. Everything is fine, Mr. Paul. Professor Anderson will be here in a minute. We'll explain. Explain what? Thought Paul with some exasperation. But at least she speaks English, even though I can't place her accent. Anderson must have been already on his way, for the door opened a moment later to give Paul a brief glimpse of a small crowd of inquisitive onlookers peering in at him. He began to feel like a new exhibit at a zoo. Professor Anderson was a small, dapper man whose features seemed to have combined key aspects of several races: Chinese, Polynesian, Nordic, in a thoroughly confusing fashion. He greeted Paul by holding up his right palm, then did an obvious double take and shook hands with such a curious hesitation that he might have been rehearsing some quite unfamiliar gesture. Glad to see you are looking so well, Mr. Paul. We'll have you up in no time. Again that odd accent and slow delivery, but the confident bedside manner was that of all doctors in all places and all ages. I'm glad to hear it. Now perhaps you can answer a few questions. Of course, but just a minute. Anderson spoke so rapidly and quietly to the matron, and Paul could catch only a few words, several of which were wholly unfamiliar to him. Then the matron noticed at one of the nurses, who opened a wall cupboard and produced a slim metal band, which she proceeded to ram around Paul's head. What's that for? He asked, being one of those difficult patients, so annoying to doctors. He always wants to know just what's happening to them. Easy, read out. Professor, matron, and nurses looked weakly baffled. Then a slow smile spread across Anderson's face. Oh, electro, except hologram, he said slowly, as if dredging the word up from the depths of memory. You are quite right. We just want to monitor your brain functions. My brain would function perfectly well if you'd let me use it. Paul grumbled silently, but at least we seem to be getting somewhere. Finally, Mr. Paul, said Anderson, still speaking in that curious, stilted voice, as if venturing in a foreign language. You know, of course, then you were disabled in a serious accident while you were walking outside Discovery. Paul nodded agreement. I'm beginning to suspect, he said dryly, that disabled is a slight understatement. Anderson relaxed visibly, and a slow smile spread across his face. You are quite correct. Tell me what you think happened. Well, the bad case scenario is that after I became unconscious, Dave Bowman rescued me and brought me back to the sick. How's your dad? No one will tell me anything? World due course. And the worst case, it seemed to Frankfurt that a chilly wind was blowing gently on the back of his neck. His suspicions that had been slowly forming in his mind began to solidify. That I died, but was brought back here, wherever here is, and you've been able to revive me. Thank you. Quite correct. And you are back on us. Well, very near it. What did he mean by very near it? There was certainly a gravity field here, so he could probably inside a slowly turning wheel of an orbiting space station. No matter, there was something much more important to think about. Paul did some quick mental calculation. If Dave had put him in the hibernaculum, revived the rest of the crew, completed the mission of Jupiter, why he could have been dead for as much as 5 years. Just what date is it? He asked as calmly as possible. Professor and the matron exchanged glances. Again Paul felt the cool wind on his neck. I must tell you, Mr. Paul, that Bowman did not rescue you. He believed, and we cannot blame him, that you were irrevocably dead. Also, he was facing a desperately serious crisis that threatened his own survival. So you drift on into space, pass through the Jupiter system, and headed out toward the stars. Fortunately, you were so far below freezing point that there were no metabolism, but it's a nearly near miracle that you were ever found at all. You are one of the luckiest men alive. No, ever to have lived. Am I? Paul asked himself bleakly. 5 years, indeed. It could be a century, or even more. Let me have it, he demanded. Professor and Maestron seemed to be consulting with the invisible monitor, and they looked at each other and nodded agreement. Paul guessed that they were all plugged into the hospital information circuit linked to the headband he was wearing. Frank, said Professor Anderson, making a smooth switch to the role of a long-time family physician. This will be a great shock to you, but you're capable of accepting it, and the sooner you know, the better. You are nearly the beginning of the first millennium. Believe me, you left us almost 1,000 years ago. I believe you, Paul answered calmly. Then, to his great annoyance, the room started to spin around him, and he knew nothing more. When he regained consciousness, he found that he was no longer in a bleak hospital room, but a luxurious suite with attractive and steadily changing images on the walls. Some of these were famous and familiar paintings. Others showed land and seascapes that might have been from his own time. There was nothing alien or upsetting that he guessed would come later. His present surrounding had obviously been carefully programmed. He wondered if there was the equivalent of a television screen somewhere. How many channels would the first millennium have? But could see no sign of any control near his bed. There was so much he would have to learn in this new world. He was a savage who had suddenly encountered civilization. But first, he must regain his strength and learn the language. Not even the advent of sound recording, already more than a century old when Poole was born, had prevented major changes in grammar and pronunciation. And there were thousands of new words, mostly from science and technology, though often he was able to make a shrewd guess at their meaning. More frustrating, however, were the myriad of famous and infamous personal names that had accumulated over the millennium and which meant nothing to him. For weeks, until he had built up a data bank, most of his conversation had to be interrupted with potted biographies. As Poole's strength increased, so did the number of his visitors, although always under Professor Anderson's watchful eye. They included medical specialists, scholars of several disciplines, and of the greatest interest to him, spacecraft commanders. There were little that he could tell the doctors and historians that was not recorded somewhere in mankind's gigantic data banks, but he was often able to give them research support and new insight about the events of his own time. Though they all treated him with the utmost respect and listened patiently as he tried to answer their question, they seemed reluctant to answer his. Poole began to feel that he was being overprotected from culture shock and half seriously wondered how he could escape from his suit. On a few occasions, he was alone. He was not surprised to discover that the door was locked. Then the arrival of Dr. Interwallis changed everything. Despite her name, her chief racial component appeared to be Japanese, and there were times when with just a little imagination, Poole could picture her as a rather mature geisha girl. It was hardly an appropriate image for a distinguished historian holding a virtual chair at the university still boasting real ivy. She was the first visitor with a fluent command of Paul's own English, so he was delighted to meet her. Mr. Paul, she began in a very business-like voice. I've been appointed your official guide and, let's say, mentor. My qualification, I've specialized in your period. My thesis was the collapse of the nation states, 2000 to 50. I believe we can help each other in many ways. I'm sure you can. First, I'd like you to get me out of here so I can see a little of your world. Exactly what I intend to do, but first we must give you an ident. Until then, you'll be, what was the term, a non-person. It would be almost impossible for you to go anywhere or get anything done. No input device would recognize your existence. Just what I expected, Paul answered with a wry smile. It was starting to get that way in my own time, and many people hated the idea. Some still do. They go off and live in a wilderness. There's a lot more on us than there was in your country, but they always take their campbag with them, so they can call for help as soon as they get into trouble. The median time is about 5 days. Sorry to hear that. The human race has obviously deteriorated. He was cautiously testing her, trying to find the limits of her tolerance and to map out her personality. It was obvious that they were going to spend much time together and that he would have to depend upon her in hundreds of ways. Yet, he was still not sure if he would even like her. Perhaps she regarded him merely as a fascinating museum exhibit. Rather to Paul's surprise, she agreed with his criticism. That may be true. In some respect, perhaps you are physically weaker, but if healthier, then better adjust than most humans who ever lived. The noble savage was always a miss. She walked over to a small rectangular plate, set at eye level in the eye. It was about the size of one of the countless magazines that had proliferated in the far-off age of print, and Paul had noticed that every room seemed to have at least one. Usually they were blank, but sometimes they contained lines of slowly scrolling text, completely meaningless to Paul, even when most of the words were familiar. Once a plate in his suit had emitted urgent beepings, which he had ignored on the assumption that someone else would deal with the problem, whatever it was. Fortunately, the noise stopped abruptly as it had started. Dr. Wallis raised the palm of her hand upon the plate, then removed it after a few seconds. She glanced at Paul and said smilingly, "Come on, look at this." The inscription that had suddenly appeared made a good deal of sense. When you read it slowly, Wallis Intra F 297.03.1131.88A Hist Oxford. I suppose it means female, date of birth 11th March 2970, and that you are associated with the Department of History of Oxford. And I guess that 31.885 is your personal identification number, correct? Excellent, Mr. Put. I've been some of your email address and credit card number, hideous string of alphanumeric gibberish that no one could possibly remember, but you all know our date of birth, and not more than 99,999 other people will share it. So, a five-figure number is all you'll ever need. And even if you forget that, it doesn't really matter. As you see, it's a part of you. Implant? Yes. Nanochip at birth, one of which farm for redundancy. You won't even feel yours when it goes in. But you've given us a small problem. What's that? The readers we'll meet most of the time are too simple-minded to believe your date of birth. So, with your permission, we've moved it up 1,000 years. Permission granted, and the rest of the ident optional. You can leave it empty, give your current interest and location, or use it for personal message, global or targeted. Some things Paul was quite sure would not have changed over the centuries. A high proportion of those targeted messages would be very personal indeed. He wondered if there were still self or state-appointed censors in this day or an age, and if their effort at improvement of the people's morals had been more successful than in his own time. He would have to ask Dr. Wallis about it, and he got to know her better.